If you don't live on the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal is likely a country that doesn't often cross your mind. It sits on a narrow strip at the very edge of the European continent. Its land area ranks only 109th in the world, with a population of just over 10 million, ranking 89th globally. But once upon a time, Portugal's status was far more significant than it is today. At the height of its global influence, the Portuguese Empire spanned the globe. Stretching from South America all the way to Asia, it controlled the entire Indian Ocean and monopolized the world's most lucrative trade routes. Its land territory across 4 continents even surpassed the size of the Roman Empire at its peak under Emperor Trajan. However, over the centuries, this empire was gradually dismantled, eventually shrinking to the modest nation we see today. Yet, land isn't everything. In the 21st century, while Portugal's landmass may be small, its presence on the high seas is anything but. Starting from Lisbon, it reaches across the Atlantic halfway to North America. Furthermore, there are plans to make this maritime territory even larger. If everything goes according to plan, Portugal will significantly expand its oceanic reach. By combining its land and sea territories, it would leap to become the 16th largest country in the world, surpassing many nations typically considered much larger. Over 600 years ago, Portugal became the first European nation to expand beyond the continent. In 1415, it captured Ceuta from the Moors, igniting the era of European overseas expansion. At the time, no one knew, including the Portuguese themselves, that they would also be the last European power to end their colonial era. The span of their empire lasted nearly 6 centuries. During this time, the Portuguese Empire expanded rapidly across the globe. Explorers, merchants, and soldiers searched for new lands to trade, develop, and settle. Portugal became history's first global maritime and commercial empire. For centuries, it remained one of the world's top powers. It once sat to divide the world with Spain and narrow waterways. Portugal dominated the Indian Ocean and monopolized the highly profitable spice trade. By the second half of the 16th century, Portuguese naval outposts stretched from Lisbon all the way to Nagasaki. By the early 19th century, the empire spanned Brazil, Africa, India, and Southeast Asia. However, a series of severe misfortunes led to the empire's eventual decline. In 1755, a massive earthquake destroyed the capital, Lisbon, dealing a heavy blow to their overseers' ambitions. In 1807, Napoleon's forces invaded and occupied Portugal. The royal family was forced to flee Lisbon for Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. After Napoleon's defeat and Portugal's liberation, the monarchy remained in Brazil, naming Rio de Janeiro as the new capital of the Portuguese Empire. This was the only time in history a European power was ruled from one of its colonies. But this did not last long. Only 6 years later, a liberal revolution broke out in mainland Portugal. The king was forced to return to Europe, while the prince remaining in Brazil declared independence, crowning himself the Emperor of Brazil. In 1825, Portugal recognized Brazilian independence. Losing its largest and most valuable territory was a devastating political and economic blow to Portugal, one from which it never truly recovered. After the loss of Brazil, Portugal shifted its focus back to Africa for the remainder of the 19th century, the continent where its expansion first began. Its primary holdings were on opposite coasts of the continent, modern-day Angola and Mozambique. The goal was to expand into the African interior, creating a continuous belt of Portuguese territory from west to east. However, this ambition directly clashed with British plans to link Cape Town in South Africa to Cairo in Egypt. Eventually, Britain issued an ultimatum to Portugal: abandon the push for Central Africa or face the consequences. Portugal chose to yield retaining only Angola and Mozambique. By the early 20th century, Portugal still held a vast empire in Africa and Asia. But after WWI, the wave of authoritarianism sweeping Europe reached Portugal, evolving into a regime led by Antonio de Oliveira. Portugal remained neutral during World War II. After the war, decolonization movements surged globally, but Portugal strongly resisted. The Salazar government stopped calling it an empire, rebranding Portugal as a pluricontinental nation, with various overseas provinces, while other European powers admitted their holdings were colonies. Portugal insisted these territories were legal, integral provinces. They promoted the image of a multi-continental, multi-ethnic state. During this time, maps were produced to illustrate just how vast the nation was. One map showed that mainland Europe could fit inside Angola 10 times over. Another showed the combined provinces spanning nearly the width of Europe. Regardless of the government's rhetoric, these areas were still largely treated as colonies. Less than 1% of the native population ever actually attained full citizenship rights. Tensions and inequality persisted. As more colonies worldwide gained independence, the Portuguese regime remained determined to hold on at any cost. This led to decades of conflict. After India's independence in Portugal refused to return Goa, claiming it was an indivisible part of Portuguese soil. Eventually, India seized Goa by force in 1961. Around the same time, violent protests against Portuguese rule broke out in Angola and spread to other African territories. Throughout the 1960s, while most European powers withdrew from Africa, Portugal fought a 13-year guerrilla war to maintain its hold. They implemented mandatory conscription, forcing men to serve for 4 years, most of whom were sent to fight in Africa. An entire generation was sent to the battlefield, while thousands of others fled the country to avoid the draft. By the early 1970s, Portugal was almost entirely focused on these wars. 40% of the national budget was spent on military efforts. The military was overextended across 3 African fronts, and its rigid colonial stance led to increasing international isolation. By 1974, with 20% of the male population mobilized, the people were weary of war. That year, a coup d'etat by military officers overthrew the 43-year-old dictatorship. The new government immediately ended the wars and pursued decolonization. By 1975, all African colonies in East Timor and Asia had declared independence. Portugal was the first European power to settle in Africa in 1415. And nearly 6 centuries later, it was the last to leave. In 1999, the handover of Macau to China officially marked the end of Portugal's transcontinental imperial history. Today, Portugal's remaining lands are its European mainland, along with the Madeira and Azores archipelago. But as they have done many times before, the Portuguese have found a way to appear much larger than they are. In 1994, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea came into effect. This treaty established the maritime zones countries can legally claim, including territorial waters and exclusive economic zones. Territorial waters extend 12 nautical miles from the coast, where a state has full sovereignty. The EEZ extends from 12 to 200 nautical miles. While they don't have sovereignty over the surface, they have exclusive rights to the resources on and below the seabed. They cannot stop ships from passing, but they own all the fishing, oil, gas, and mineral rights. This is why countries today compete so fiercely for tiny islands. It's not about the island itself, but the 200-mile radius of potentially vast resources surrounding it. For Portugal, this is crucial. Under these rules, Portugal currently has the 20th largest EEZ in the world, encompassing the waters around the mainland, Madeira, and the Azores. For the 109th largest country by land, having the 20th largest maritime economic zone is a massive advantage. But Portugal plans to go even further. The UN Convention also allows for the extension of maritime territory onto the outer continental shelf. Nations can claim areas from 200 up to 350 nautical miles out. In this zone, they don't control the water itself, but they have exclusive rights to the seabed and the subsoil. They can't stop fishing or sailing, but they own the mining and drilling rights. Portugal's application to the UN would expand its total North Atlantic maritime area to over 3.87 million square kilometers. Once approved, its maritime territory would jump from 20th to 10th in the world. If you combine land and sea, Portugal will become the 16th largest nation on Earth. By this calculation, over 97% of Portugal would be water. But this is precisely the plan. 6 centuries ago, Portugal set sail to build an empire. Its 21st century plan is to return to that same ocean. This time, to master the sea and its resources, rather than distant lands and peoples.